Good morning. It has become a spiritual practice for me to reread sermons from Martin Luther King around his birthday. And after each reading, I'm reminded of his brilliance, prophetic voice, his sense of justice, courage, his unrelenting belief that someday we would have a nation that has confronted and dealt with racial justice and equality for all. I admire his passion, his imagination, and ability to mobilize others to imagine another way of life. And I continue to get frustrated, and this year really terrified that what he was talking about seems so far out of reach. In fact, the events of this past week and the threat hanging over our head of even more acts of insurrection has me near speechless and certainly sleepless. I had thought that a few days would pass and the country would find some semblance and sanity, but I've yet to see and witness that. And then I find something that he has written that can help me to stay involved, to stay committed to his vision, and to evoke and to find some hope. And I imagine maybe this, and what I mean by that, maybe this absolute threat to our democracy and this madness had to occur to get us to begin to see a way to move forward. Again and again, I'm reminded that churches and religious leaders need to be the voice to lead the way. And yet I need the words and voice of Dr. King to guide and help me. And this is from his sermon, A Knock at Midnight. The church must be reminded that it is not the master or servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state and never its tool. If the church does not capture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. If the church does not participate actively in the struggle for peace and for economic and racial justice, it will forfeit the loyalty of millions and cause people everywhere to say that it has atrophied its will. But if the church will speak and act fearlessly and insistently in terms of justice and peace, it will rekindle the imagination of humankind and the souls of all, imbuing them with a glowing and ardent love for truth, justice, and peace. And how do we do this? King reminds us, and I say, by staying focused on love for truth, justice, and peace, and by coming together and expressing our common values, by organizing for change and using our imagination. Now, King's dream of social equality is far from a reality. You've heard it before, you get it, you know it. And I thought about not saying it, but I must continue to expose the open secret that persons of color still rank lower in health and economic well-being and overall life quality and safety. And jobs, if they exist, pay barely enough per hour to support a family. And with this pandemic, some know even more financial and health hardships. And we are a nation at war within our own country. It is a cold war. But if we are not very, very careful, it will become a hot war. Things need to change, and we need to be a part of the process assisting that change. But King's words are a reminder of how challenging it is to bring about change. You know that old axiom, the more things change, the more they stay the same? Oh, that seems apropos. So Reverend Martin Luther King's story is one of courage, wisdom, and the power of charismatic and prophetic leadership. His life journey is one that few of us would choose or have even the stamina to follow. And he was assassinated trying to bring economic justice to garbage workers, all the while challenging the powers to be during the war in Vietnam. times, I think, to figure out what makes a person who they are, it's kind of helpful to go back into their life story. So let's go back into the life of Dr. King. He was born January 15th, 1929, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Michael. His father, Big Mike, or Daddy King, changed both names to Martin when the younger was 5. Martin Jr. had a younger brother, A.D., and an older sister, Christine, and they grew up on Auburn Street in Atlanta, a black, up-and-coming neighborhood with law offices, small businesses, night spots, cafes, an up-and-coming neighborhood, but one not immune from the racial segregation and violence of the 30s. And it was a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and where high standards of behavior were established for all children, especially for the preacher's kids. Now, Martin Jr. adored his mother, as she often helped him to navigate conversations with his father, who was a difficult and demanding man. And his devotion and affection to his maternal grandmother, who lived with the family, was really character defining and helped make him who he was. It was interesting to find out that twice during his early years, he made attempts on his life. And both of those times were after he was caught doing something wrong. So the standards of behavior were set, and his father often whipped he and A.D. for breaking the rules. That relationship with his father was a mixture of respect, fear, anger, rebellion, and love. And that seems to have infused Martin with as a biographer notes, an inordinate compulsion to take on himself cargoes of guilt. And I think that the foundation of love for family and neighborhood, for church, for society, for the beloved community, had its root in his early years. And I also want to say, if you live with a difficult person such as his father, and if you want to believe the best about everyone, as his grandmother and mother did, striving for peace might be a part of who you are. Now, his father expected that Martin would one day share the pulpit with him, the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, but Martin wanted no part of sharing his father's pulpit, so he went off to Morehouse College, majoring in sociology, thinking to become a lawyer. But after graduation from there, he attended Crozier Theological Seminary, where he made the decision to enter the ministry, but not at his father's pulpit. And after graduating with his doctorate from Boston University, he went to serve the Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And it was while at BU he met and married Coretta Scott. Together they had 5 children. And he was reluctantly thrown into the civil rights battle when his colleague, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, involved him in the Montgomery bus boycott, when Rosa Parks, as part of an organized resistant movement, refused to move and to give up her seat on the bus. And one day he declared to his congregation, "History has thrust something upon me from which I cannot turn away." And thus began his tireless work for civil rights that would eventually cost him his life when assassinated on April 4th, 1968, at 39 years old. His life's work as a religious civic leader committed to racial unity and equality, economic justice, and the removal of barriers that keep people from being peaceful and justice-seeking persons must continue with us. That selfless giving. So what does it mean to cultivate the well-being of the other so that we can flourish? And he would propose that preservation of the self relies on preservation of the other, and that this is the root of all moral codes. And it is the truth that we need others and others need us. And King said, "In every human being there exists, however dimly, a certain natural identification with every other human being, so that we tend to feel what happens to a fellow human being in some way happens to us. And he adds, I would love to talk to him about this. He says, therefore, no one can very long continue to abuse another human being without beginning to feel in himself or herself at least some dull, answering stir of discomfort. I want to talk about that with him, but I do like this. He says, when an oppressor's violence is met with a forgiving love, they can be reborn as a human being. For me, that's the core of that non-violence resistance. And I suppose it would serve us well to revisit that concept. Non-violence is being willing to take a stand to not engage in behavior or thought that retaliates when people disagree or when authority tries to silence us. And King said that non-violent approach does not immediately change the oppressor. He says it first does something to the hearts and souls of those committed to it. It gives new respect, it calls up resources of strength and courage, and finally it reaches the opponent and so stirs their conscience that reconciliation becomes a reality. Violence returns violence, and hate returns hate. Love breeds love. Non-violence is an ideal worth striving for. King was about building alliances, and those who went to Selma and witnessed with him, and even our own James Reeb, who died while he was there at the hands of these terrorists, were there because King built coalitions, built alliances, and that art of building alliances is complex. When all people can come together and see one another and sit down together to build mutual respect and mutual goals, then things can change. And this requires living with ambiguity, with admitting ignorance of others' cultures, histories, and requires a commitment to remain in relationship even when feeling scared or uncertain. To overcome oppression, to build a more equitable world, we must build genuine relationships. And I also believe we must grasp in very, very deepest places our vastness and our insignificance. We are grander than we can ever imagine, and we are insignificant as well. And this awareness will help to keep us humble, honest, and relate to others no matter whether they are like us or not. So how do we speak out? How do we become a voice? Well, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Jewish teacher, wrote, in a sense, the prophet may be described as an advocate or a champion, speaking for those who are too weak to plead their own cause. Now, indeed, the major activity of the prophets was interference, meddling in affairs. And King can teach us to be a prophet, a meddler, and a builder of coalitions. And he developed a life philosophy, a core of being that did not accept turning away when he saw wrongs, when he saw pain. He developed a coalition of people around him who together they spoke up, they meddled, and they interfered. Now, have you at the core of your being something so strong that no matter the storms that batter your door, the struggles that assail you, ail you, that you will hold on to a conviction? Well, I know King did. And whatever he had, charisma, conviction, stamina, prophetic vision, it inspires me. It inspires me still. It makes me willing to be a meddler. Are you brave enough to be a meddler? It is true, not all of us can be the Martin Luther King Jr.'s of the world, and not all of us can be prophets of challenge and confrontation. But all of us, every one of us, can begin the process of justice making. All of us can look at who we are personally and who we are institutionally, and we can look at the relationships and the community ties that we have, and we can use these to empower the disenfranchised and create whole, beloved communities. Beloved communities made of diverse points of view, a place and a space that, despite differences in cultural, racial, ethnic backgrounds, regardless of age, economic, politics, class, gender, or educational opportunities, and out of many life experiences, is a community where we can bring the best out into the world. And that does involve nonviolent resolution of conflict. And the building of beloved communities requires understanding the interconnectedness of all humanity and a humble knowledge of from earth we came, to earth we return. We are a broken, hurting nation right now, and there is a madness that we are in the midst of, and King's words and his legacy is a source to tap in to help healing. And to help put an end to this madness we are living in, we must stop thinking about right and wrong, and we must think about understanding and dialogue. And that is so hard because it involves dialogue, even with those we don't understand or we think are our enemy. For if we continue to call names, to label bad guys versus good guys versus us versus them, peace has no chance whatsoever. And now, in our nation's life, we must come together. We must refuse to be silenced. We must come together to find answers and reach out and touch others who are struggling. And we can respond with an honest desire to transform, to make a difference, and to be meddlers. And that's hard. I remember the few times I took a stand. It was hard. And I know also there were many other times that I should have spoken up, but I did not. And so I can just barely imagine what it must have been like to live a life totally dedicated to speaking out as Martin Luther King Jr. did, knowing that it was going to lead to his death. But more, I think it would mean that you were continually being challenged, and that you were not just by others being challenged, but by yourself being challenged. I mean, asking yourself, am I doing the right thing? For what am I doing this? Why am I meddling? What is my purpose? What are my intentions? What's my impact? And is any of this going to matter when I'm gone? So the ideals from those whose journey we remember and respect is nourishment for our own ideals. Yes, ideals do live on, even though the living, breathing person is gone. And their ideals infuse and interweave in our very being until they are a part of us. And for this, I am grateful to remember the legacy that Martin Luther King Jr. left. Let us remember him and his many words of wisdom, his voice, his prophetic being, and his ultimate sacrifice. What say you?